Hello everyone, welcome to episode 10 of this chess speedrun series. My name is Alex, I'm rated just over 2000 ELO, and in this series we're going from 1000 to 2000 ELO on chess.com rapid, and I'm going to be talking you through my thought process while we play. And we get a Vienna, but not just a Vienna, because my opponent goes knight to f6, which allows a Vienna Gambit. And we're going to see if my opponent knows the theory on this. I have an entire playlist dedicated to games on my channel that I've played in the Vienna, so make sure you check that out at the end of the video if you want to learn more. But this is really tough for black to deal with. Really, really tough, because the difference is, if you play a King's Gambit, right? So if you play King's Gambit with f4 immediately, then black is supposed to take. And technically it is worse for white, but it's very difficult for black to navigate. The difference here is after knight to c3 and knight to f6 are included, f4 is far more powerful because of, I would say, two reasons. So firstly, black can't take. Black cannot take this pawn. I mean, he can, but it's bad because of the move e5, and he does take it. So the problem is that we have e5. And there's two very big differences to the King's Gambit. Firstly, is that the queen can't come to h4 to deliver this nasty check, where g3 is pretty much unplayable because of f takes g3. This doesn't exist in this opening because the queen cannot get to h4 because the knight is blocking the queen, of course. Secondarily, we can go e5 attacking the knight, and the knight cannot move forward in any direction, which means it will have to go back to g8. Now, whether he does it on this move or not, a lot of people like to play queen to e7, pinning the pawn, which is actually worse, but my opponent doesn't do it. He retreats the knight, and you can see that this is so much better than a typical King's Gambit setup. Knight to f3 is the move. Now, because the knight has now retreated, you cannot allow the move queen to h4 check, because that is a problem. Like if you were to play bishop c4 here, which is the kind of move that you want to play, queen to h4 is a problem, and you probably have to play king to f1. But then, I don't know, even after moves like f3 opening up an attack on the bishop, that's incredibly uncomfortable. My opponent opts for bishop to e7, and I've never seen this move, but it's a very interesting move because I think his idea is to play bishop to h4 check, right? And if I take and take, then we have the same problem that I just described. So I'm thinking that I might have to go bishop c4, right? And ideally I would castle, and then we don't have to worry about bishop to h4. So let's say I go bishop c4 and my opponent goes knight to c6, then we just castle. But if he goes bishop to h4 check, I don't really want to play g3. That's kind of silly. Because I will just be losing a pawn and my king will have to move anyway. So if bishop c4, bishop h4 check, I probably have to go king to f1 in that position. Which I said before I didn't want to do, but that's when the queen goes to h4. When the bishop goes to h4, the queen is kind of tied down to defending the bishop, and it doesn't look all that impressive. It also takes a good bit of time for my opponent to actually do. Although, now I'm thinking about it, the move h4 is very, very tempting for me. Because we stop this, and we also give a support to the g5 square in the future if we want to put a knight there. My only concern is maybe this knight can hop into the g3 square, which will be weakened by the move h4, obviously. But if h4, knight h6, d4, knight f5, we have bishop takes f4 guarding that square. So I'm going to go h4. I don't know whether this is the correct move or not. I've never seen the move bishop to e7. So if you do play the Vienna, or want to start playing the Vienna, make sure you stick around to the analysis section of this video. Or depending on how quick this game is, it might just be this game, and then we might play another game afterwards. Again, depending on how long this game goes for. But whether h4 is the best move or not here, I actually don't know. I honestly don't know. You may be able to play bishop c4, bishop h4, and king to f1. That might be completely viable. but I have a feeling that h4 is a very useful move, because we also make it difficult for black to play g5 to try and hold on to the pawn, and my opponent goes d6. Now what you need to know in these positions is do not take. Do not take that pawn. That only helps black. Only helps black. Now, I'm very tempted to play the move bishop to c4 here and let my opponent take. And I might not even take back. I might not even take back. There's a lot of lines where you play like d4 takes and bishop c4 and let your opponent take here if they want. There's a lot of lines that go like that. And then there are some ways in which your opponent can't take on c3 because of bishop to f7 tactics deflecting the king from the queen, but because the bishop is on e7 defending the queen, that doesn't quite make as much sense here. Again, taking only helps black because bishop comes to d6 defending the pawn, the knight's going to come to e7 or f6 because we now no longer control that square. So d4 and bishop c4 are my candidate moves. Now, d4, d takes e5. What can I do? Bishop c4 is the natural move. Now I have to consider what happens if my opponent takes. What do I do? Well, I'm not exactly sure. Not totally sure. Because this is actually a threat. So, if I play bishop c4 first and then d takes e5, I don't have to worry about taking on here because I haven't yet committed to the move d4. And the pawn can't really advance to e4 because I control that square. So, bishop c4 is the move I'm going to play, and we're going to see what happens. Now, just through playing this opening a lot, I know that this setup with the knights on f3 and c3 and the bishop on c4 is kind of the way to go, and that if your opponent does take on e5, even if you don't get that pawn back, it's really not the end of the world. I think that actually the move might be queen e2. Does it prepare d4? I don't know, but it is an idea. It is definitely an idea. Ooh, that is interesting, because I can already see potential tactics brewing. Let's say it was my opponent's turn here, and he takes on e5. I have bishop f7 check, followed by king takes f7, and then knight takes e5 check, winning the bishop. So my opponent has to be very careful, but I can't play h3 to kick the bishop out, which helps my opponent. Now d4 is the move that I want to play here, because my opponent cannot take on e5 because of bishop takes f7. Of course, if I go d4, and my opponent takes on e5, and then I take on f7, my opponent doesn't have to take back. Now, if he goes to d7, we still have the same trick because it comes with check anyway, so he would have to go to f8. And I'm not exactly sure what the follow-up would be there. We might just have to retreat the bishop, or take the knight on g8. However, if we go d4 and my opponent takes, we don't have to take on f7, although I probably want to. I think that's fine. Let me just think real quick. Because there are some ideas of like knight g5, bishop takes d1, bishop f7, king f8, and knight to e6 check. But even if that works, we're not winning any material at all. Yeah, we're not winning anything, so I don't see the point in going for that. d4 takes, bishop f7, king f8. What do we do there? What do we do? Maybe bishop to d5, blocking the queen's vision of d4 and defending the knight and attacking b7. I think we'll figure it out. Let's go d4 for now. By the way, if you are enjoying the video so far and you haven't yet already, I would really appreciate it if you could drop a like and subscribe. It really motivates me to keep making these videos and hopefully keep entertaining and educating you guys for the foreseeable future. I'm really enjoying this series, just like myself, and based on the comments that I've been getting recently, you guys seem to really be liking it too. So that is absolutely fantastic. This is a very interesting position, and it's one of the reasons that I absolutely love the Vienna Gambit, because It's difficult for white to navigate, no doubt, no doubt. And there are ideas of taking on h4 for my opponent. There are definitely ideas of taking on h4 because the knight is pinned to the queen, right? Now, if my opponent does take on h4 and rook takes, my opponent might be able to take on f3 and then after queen takes, take on h4, and we will look at that with the engine after the game. But my opponent chooses the move knight to d7. Interesting, interesting. So I think we can probably just go ahead and take on f4. Now, interestingly, if I take on f4 and my opponent takes on e5, I can no longer go for this trick of bishop f7, king f7, and knight to e5, because my opponent can take on e5 with the knight, which also defends his bishop. So that no longer works. However, if bishop f4, de5, I think we can just take back on e5, because my opponent can't trade queens with me, because he shut the file by putting the knight on d7, and we win back the pawn, and if any shenanigans happen on h4, we can now play g3, because my bishop will be controlling the g3 square. So that is all very good. That is all very good. Let me just have a little think here. Bishop f7, king f7, knight g5, bishop g5, queen g4, bishop e7. We do have the move e6 there, forking the king and the knight. And then we win our piece. Ooh, does that work? Does that work? Bishop f7, king f7, knight g5 check. Now, if my opponent moves the king, I take the bishop and I'm completely winning, right? So takes, check, bishop has to take. Queen takes g4. What does my opponent do? Because his bishop is hanging and e6 is in the air. We could play knight to h6. He could. But I think we just take on g5. No concern. That is such an interesting line, and I think it might work. Because this knight is vulnerable to forks. Bishop f7. Okay, if king f8, it doesn't matter, right? It doesn't matter. We're good. Because we just win a free pawn, my opponent can't castle. Of course, we are better there. We can just probably retreat. So bishop f7, king f7 has to be played. Forced. Forced. Knight g5 check. If my opponent retreats the king, we take the bishop. So he has to take on g5. That's forced. Queen g4. My opponent could play a move like knight to e5, sacking his knight for a pawn. And then after takes, the bishop is under attack, so the bishop has to retreat to either h6 or e7. h6 does defend the g7 pawn, but the king is defending the g7 pawn, because remember the king is on f7, so if the bishop comes back to e7, we can give this check, but we don't have to. We could just take on f4. I think that works. Let's go for it. I really hope this works. But this is way too cool not to go for. Way too cool. Let's sack the bishop. Come on. My opponent has to take. Absolutely has to. Now, there is a good chance. There is a good chance that taking on f4... Okay, let me rephrase this. There's a good chance that taking on f7 is perfectly valid. Right? But that bishop f4 might be better even if bishop f7 works. That is definitely a possibility. However, based on my calculation, I think that we get an easier to convert advantage by taking on f7. Because if we play bishop f4 here, we're better. No doubt. No doubt we're better. We have the perfect setup of the minor pieces in the center. Our pawns are fantastic in the center. Our only problems really are this pin and the weakness of the h4 pawn. But black is still lacking in development and has a severe lack of space. But this line seems more convincing to me. I'm sure I've calculated this correctly. Sure I have. Now, to be fair, after bishop g5, queen g4, my opponent could play bishop h4 check, sacking the bishop. And after, like, rook h4, he could take on e5. But after our pawn takes, he can't take with the knight because of queen takes f4 check, and the king would have to go to e6 to defend the knight. And that just looks horrific. I hope that that calculation makes sense to you guys. We will go over all of this after the game because there are some very, very interesting lines here, and we'll see exactly what the computer recommends. But in this position, we are down a piece, but the bishop is under attack, this pawn is under attack, and we are threatening the move e6 check, picking up the knight. I don't think my opponent can do anything about it. Let's do this. Interestingly, if the king goes back to e8, we could take on g7, attacking the rook. And bishop f6 attacks the queen and defends the rook via x-ray, but then queen to f7 is checkmate. So king f8 might be the only move. But then we take the knight, and my opponent can't take back. Now, yeah, he does go for king to f8, so that's good from my opponent to find that. And there's no point taking on f4 because knight to f6 blocks the check, and then we can't win the piece back, so we should just take the knight. And I'm expecting probably knight to f6 attacking my queen and attacking the d7 pawn, which he does. And he will win the pawn back, but we're going to win the f4 pawn. I think I want to take with the queen, because where else am I going to put the queen, right? This doesn't really make a lot of sense, because after queen takes, I don't want to trade queens. So let's do this. And after queen takes, I think I might just castle. Now we do have the option to play moves like knight to d5, just attacking, because the knight can't take because of the pin. But we don't really hold a threat there. We don't actually have a threat. Now, the thing is, I would like to castle queenside. Because my opponent's king is so weak. The issue is, if queen d7, and let's say we play bishop to e3, trying to castle queenside. Whoa. Okay, well, let me just say, if queen d7, bishop e3, I'm a bit worried about queen g4, because I don't want to trade the queens. My opponent goes c6. He must be terrified of the move knight to d5, which I don't really understand why. It seems like it's just giving us a free move to do something. This pawn is completely hanging. I guess he thinks that he can just take it at any point, which is true. But he's giving us time to castle, which seems a bit foolish. Can't we play g4? Just threatening g5? If g4 h6, we can't really play g5 because of takes, and we hang the rook. So g4 h6 is probably the only move for black. Does weaken g6 a lot, and I'd love to get a knight there, but it's going to be difficult. Maybe that isn't the best course of action, because it weakens the g4 square. Well, we have a target on g4, so after queen takes d7, my opponent actually has a threat. So maybe just bishop d2? And queen d7 castles. If queen g4, maybe we just go like queen back to f2 and just chill. And then we have ideas like bishop to g5, maybe rook f1, maybe pushing this pawn forward, rook to e1. That is pretty good. Maybe he wants to go d5 and prepare queen d7, bishop d6, potentially. We will find out after the game whether what my opponent has done is good or not. But c6 seems like a colossal waste of time. A colossal waste of time that I don't think he could afford to waste. Let's castle. Let's castle. The knight is still pinned. Queen g4 is the move I'm expecting. And I don't really want to trade queens, because we do have equal material here, but obviously my opponent's king is a lot weaker than my king. Obviously. And if I can maybe get h5, h6 in to try and weaken the f6 square, that'll be pretty good. Also, queen to g4 might help us a little bit, because after queen f2, we maintain the pin on the knight, but we get our queen out the way to prepare the move bishop to g5 to put pressure on the knight. So that's quite nice. That's quite nice. And then we have moves like rook e1, maybe having tactics with taking the bishop. We have moves like rook to f1 potentially. We have moves like h5 and h6. It's a very nice position. It's a very nice position. It's difficult for black to play this because this rook doesn't... Well, the obvious square is e8 to put the rook, right? Even then, it's not an amazing piece. King e8. No way. No way. Rook e1 looks like the obvious move. Maybe my opponent's going to keep running and try and get to the queen side. Maybe that's the plan. Rook e1, king d8. Well, rook e1 maybe has a threat of like takes rook e1, but of course, if we take, he could take with the king. But that opportunity exists. We could start with the move h5 to try and play h6. But if my opponent plays h6, this is a potentially permanent weakness on h5, which I don't love. I don't love. g7 is also weak. So you could argue that a move like queen g5 makes sense, because if g6, then f6 is weakened. But I don't like this alignment, really. I'm going to start with rook d to e1. Start simple and just attack the weak square. I'm obviously relatively low on time, so I want to try and keep my moves a little bit simple. Okay. Maybe we just double up on the e-file. I also like queen to g3, targeting g7. If queen g3, queen g4 though, it's a little bit annoying. Little bit annoying. Let me think. Maybe knight to e4 offering a knight trade, which is hard for my opponent to refuse. Because if a move like queen g4, like take, if bishop takes, d6 hangs, although d4 also hangs. But then rook e7 looks very strong. d5 is tempting, but I don't think it does anything. I'm actually going to offer a knight trade, which might seem odd, but if my opponent goes knight to d5 attacking my queen, I think I have maybe queen to f7 ideas. Just hitting a lot of different things. Okay, rook f8 is also completely valid. Now we could consider the move knight to g5, threatening knight to e6. We could also take, but that just seems to help black. Let me think. If knight g5, knight d5, queen g3, that looks very nice. That looks very nice. If queen g4, then we just take, and take on e6, winning the rook. I think my opponent had to take that because I don't think he can allow my knight into the g5 square because e6 is incredibly weak. And potentially even h7. In some lines, we might just be able to grab a pawn on h7 and just be up a clean pawn with an initiative. Let's see what he does. Let's see what he does. He is doing well to try to manage this position and not just lose instantly. So fair play. Also, I think he's Filipino. I think that's the Filipino flag because it's got the tiny little white bit. Sorry, the tiny little yellow bit in the white triangle. So it's not the Czech Republic. I hope I've got those flags the right way and I've described that properly. I don't know, actually. It might be a bit different. But anyway, GeoGuessr aside, this is a commanding position. My only gripe is that my bishop and my queen and my knight are kind of stepping on each other's toes because they're all trying to like access the same diagonal, right? Like one of the issues with this line was that my queen ended up on f4 and this bishop, I would have put it on g5 or even f4 to target d6, but it's stuck on d2 for the time being, which isn't ideal. But you can't have everything. You can't have everything. You got to work with what you've got. And my queen will move at some point because I will not leave it in this firing line for much longer. I think queen 2 g3 makes the most sense, keeping an eye on a lot of things, also stopping rook f2 ideas. If I play this immediately, can I play this immediately? Actually. Because if the king moves, then I take on f8, and if knight takes, then I take the queen, and I'm up an exchange. Actually, no, it's probably worse than that. I might be up a piece. If knight e6, queen takes, then we take on f8 with check, and after takes, we take the queen, and we're up an exchange. So that might be the better move. Let me just check real quick. I'm really low on time, so this is difficult, but yeah, let's do it. Let's do it. Knight e6 check. The most important thing is that knight takes f8 comes with an attack on the queen. That's the most important part. Otherwise, this wouldn't work. It's really difficult to play a move like this when your own queen is hanging, but calculate, calculate, calculate. I've said this so many times in this series. So many times. Always calculate. And we're up an exchange. And we have a commanding position. King d7. I will probably meet with rook to e1. Rook h to e1, doubling up. He goes for it. I think this makes the most sense. This knight also can't come forward in any way because our bishop dominates the knight. I talk about this geometry so often. When there's two squares between the bishop and the knight, either vertically or horizontally, the bishop can dominate the knight, or the other way around, the knight can dominate the bishop, but here it's the bishop dominating the knight. Bishop e7. Bishop g5 looks very good. Well, does it? Actually? Maybe c4 is actually better. C4, bishop h4, take, take. Come on. Take, take. We are up a piece. C4, knight to c7 hangs the bishop. So my opponent has to go for this line. He has to. He has no choice. And then we're just going to be up a piece rather than up an exchange. We may have to give up a pawn or two for it, but being up a whole piece is very tempting, which I'm going to go for, and the endgame should be relatively okay to convert. Relatively okay, because our pawn structure is decent. I wonder whether c4 is actually the best move. That would be interesting to know. But yeah, this seems like the cleanest way to go about the position, because if this knight moves anywhere, it's defending the bishop, so we just take the bishop. We just take the bishop. I mean, technically you could go to e3 to block the connection between the rooks, but of course we will just take the knight with not the bishop, not the bishop. Although, if knight e3, bishop e3, king e6, we could play bishop to g5 check. That does exist. But here, let's just do this. And after here, do not make the mistake of taking on c6 because of king takes rook. Do not make that mistake. Let me think. Yeah, I think rook takes is the better move. If bishop takes... Yeah, that's not ideal. So let's do this. I think the setup we want is after take and go g3. Also, target the d6 pawn. The d6 pawn is a weak pawn. We're also low on time though, so although bishop g5 threatens rook e7. Yeah, that's actually stronger. That's actually stronger. If h6... What about if h6? Because if rook e7 then... King c6. Check king here. Well, then we just move the bishop, right? My only issue is if king to d8... Well, no, then we just take on g7, and if you take, then I give this check and win the rook. So it does work anyway. It works anyway. And there's no other way for the king to maintain contact with the rook, so he has to go back there, and then we just move the bishop. Where do we want to put the bishop, though? Because rook f8 is an idea, and I don't love that he can do that. Don't love it. I think bishop f2 might be the best move. Which may look a bit weird. Bishop e3 I think I like, because if the rook comes to f1, it can't come to f2. And also, I would love to put it on f4, but g5 saves the pawn with an attack on the rook. Sorry, the bishop. Let's take on g7. Now h6 is hanging. And then g4 will be a passed pawn. Okay, that makes sense. I think we just attack it. No? If here, then we just bring the king, I assume. Let's do this. Maybe I allow rook to g8 there, so maybe that wasn't the best move, actually. Because I can't defend this pawn. That might be a bit inaccurate. He doesn't go for it. That is fascinating. I don't understand that move. Let's take on h5. Surely rook g8 and rook to f5 were the only tries there. Here my opponent has given up all hope because he allows my pawn through with no concern. I don't care if he's going to push over here. He has no threat. He has no threat. We will trade the pawns. Let's push. His rook isn't going to be able to help out either, because this pawn's going to become too much of a problem, and rook f1, rook g1 is not an option either, because we control the g1 square. You can't do something like this, and rook to f2 check to go to g2, because we control the f2 square as well. So my opponent cannot get his rook behind, so the rook will have to go in front. And that will trap the rook in place, essentially, because we will just play something like rook to g5. And then we will play pawn to g7. And then what we'll probably do is play something like rook to g6 followed by bishop to h6. And our bishop and pawn will lock the rook in jail. Our rook will dance either to the f8 square to force the rook to take the pawn, or we will promote, or our rook will just go all the way over to the king side, to the queen side, and pick up all the pawns. This position is completely lost for my opponent. We're going to take. This pawn is of no concern. Absolutely zero concern. Let's push, trap the rook. The rook can't go anywhere. Also can't come c8 with check because his king is blocking that. Yeah, I think he's trying to do this with check and play something like rook to c2, which is completely hopeless anyway. I was going to say a bad move would be king b1 because we're leaving ourselves open to back rank ideas, although we do have bishop at c1 to block, but I also don't see the point in allowing anything like that. Maybe king d1, because king d2 could lead to checks here. I think I like king d1 more. We leave the option of this open. I could have taken here, maybe I should have taken there. We did allow the king in, which I actually didn't realize was a potential idea. So my opponent is actually causing me a couple of problems. To be fair to him, I didn't really consider that. But no, can't we just come back up to d2 now? Because this is no longer an idea. And then if my opponent goes back, then we will take. If my opponent goes to b4, so that this doesn't come with check, then I will not play it. But my opponent resigns, maybe a little bit prematurely. But, I mean, the position is completely lost anyway. So, a very, very solid Vienna Gambit game. And there is going to be some really interesting analysis on this because there were tactics in so many different positions. We sacrificed a couple of pieces in that game, which was very enjoyable. Hopefully you guys liked the video. If you don't want to watch the analysis, that's cool. That's cool. Please do drop a like and subscribe if you enjoyed anyway. But for those of you who do want to stick around for the analysis, which I would highly encourage, let's get straight into it. Okay, so based on the game review graph, it looks like we did make a couple of mistakes here in the opening sort of stage. 85.3% accuracy though is still pretty good considering how complicated and long the game was. Let's get straight into it. e4, e5, knight c3, the Vienna. Of course, black does not have to play knight to f6 here. He could play bishop to c5. We saw in yesterday's video, my opponent played c6, which did not work. By the way, the move is d4 against c6. Knight to c6 is a move. Even d6 is a move. But my opponent goes knight to f6, which allows the Vienna Gambit with f4. And what I was saying before is, unlike the King's Gambit, where after f4 takes, you kind of have to go knight to f3 to stop queen to g5 idea, sorry, queen h4 ideas, because if you go bishop c4 immediately, this is a line, and after queen h4 you're supposed to go king to f1, but like you can't block, for example, because of fg3, and you can't take back because of mating ideas. There's also ideas of taking on e4 with check to pick up the rook. The Vienna Gambit doesn't have those issues, because instead, the knight blocks everything. After f4 takes, we just have e5. Now, a lot of people actually play queen e7 against this, because they go, oh, I'm going to attack the pawn and pin the pawn. This makes the situation so much worse for black, because after queen e2, the knight still can't advance, the pawn is defended, and it's unpinned, so the knight has to retreat. And then, again, it is worse, because, well, d4, the computer mentions this line with king d1. To be honest, I would just go knight to f3 to keep things simple. And the issue for black is that we always have threats of knight to d5, attacking the queen and attacking c7. And white doesn't actually have to play knight d5, but that idea exists. And it's also very difficult for black to develop this bishop because the queen is blocking it in. So my opponent plays the right move with knight to g8. We go knight to f3. My opponent goes bishop to e7. And h4 is a mistake. Okay, so h4 is not the move. h4 is not the move. I should have just gone bishop c4 and gone with my gut instinct. And if my opponent gives this check... g3, fg3... Oh my. You castle. Excuse me? And after g takes h2, you go king h1. And I mean, okay, I understand that black is about to get slaughtered. That makes complete sense. Ain't no way I'm seeing that. Ain't no way I'm seeing that, because the line I calculated was hg3, bishop g3, and king to f1. Or, after bishop to h4 check, king f1 immediately. This is the line I calculated, and the computer thinks that this is playable for black, which makes sense. Crazy. Crazy that you are supposed to just allow this check, play g3, and castle, and then not even take the pawn, but go king to g1, king h1. And if you don't go king to h1, then you're not winning. Taking on h2 with the king, for example, and the position is almost equal. Okay, Stockfish. Okay, Stockfish. I go h4, which is not the best move. My opponent goes d6, best move. We go bishop c4. Now, the computer wanted d4 here, but after d takes e5, you're supposed to go d takes e5, which is not in the spirit of the Vienna to allow the queen trade. So bishop c4, I would say, is the most Vienna-like move here. My opponent goes bishop g4. d4, best move. Here, my opponent should have taken on h4, which I did briefly mention in the game. And here, I just have to slide the king over, but I thought that this was still a pretty good position, because we have the open h-file, the bishop is under threat. Also, you can't really do this because of bishop takes f3, and both of these are hanging. So you would just have to move the king over. And the only move for black here to maintain a tiny advantage is bishop g3, which makes sense. You defend the pawn and you just keep the king in a little bit of a box. But to be honest, I think I would still take this position for the white pieces because so many tricks still exist. So, bishop g4, we go d4. My opponent can't do something like taking on e5 because of bishop to f7, king f7, and knight to e5 check, picking up the bishop. But like I mentioned, my opponent could go for a move like king to f8. And yes, okay, I'm so happy that I found the move bishop to d5. That is the only move that maintains any kind of advantage for white. I'm very happy about that. Because if black takes on d4, firstly you can take on b7 and trap the rook. But let's say c6 first. Then you're supposed to drop the bishop back to b3, and the knight can't come to the natural developing square on c6, which would have put pressure on the most important squares in the center. And if you go knight to c6 here, then d takes e5, knight takes e5, bishop f4, and the knight is defended by the bishop. So let's say something like this, the material is equal, but white has a very strong bishop pair here. And if knight takes f3, queen takes f3, the king is so weak, and white has developed very nicely. Moves like this don't work because of bishop to g3 discovered check. Although there is bishop f6. But then white just castles and the computer thinks that white is completely winning. I suppose it's just impossible for black to develop. Let's say like knight to e7, bishop e5 applies more pressure to the bishop. And how are you defending yourself? Like knight g6, takes, and then what? Like knight d5, rook a d1, like it's all winning, But my opponent goes knight to d7. And here, bishop takes f7 is a miss. Now, I actually said during my live commentary that there is a very good chance that bishop takes f4 is actually the best move, and that is true. After d takes e5, d takes e5, there's no queen trade, which I pointed out in the game. And after a move like knight to b6, now the computer wants to play bishop f7. After king f7, knight g5, bishop g5, queen g4, bishop f4, queen f4, king e8, castles kingside threatening mate in two ways, queen e7 only move, and then knight to e4, and the computer thinks that white is slightly better. No chance I'm playing this. You go down a full piece, a piece for a pawn, with no obvious win. There's no obvious advantage here. No chance I play this. So bishop f7 here. My opponent takes. Knight g5, bishop g5, queen g4. These are forced lines, absolutely forced lines. Because if the king retreats, then we just take on g4. And we have equal material with an insane initiative. Knight e6 is threatened, so you have to take on g5 anyway. You have to do it anyway. d e5, d e5, if knight e5, then there's queen f4, you have to go knight to f7 to not lose the knight, and then just castles. And this is, of course, winning for white, because the material is equal. But look at this. Look at that. It sucks. Absolutely sucks. And this knight can only go to e7, which would hang a knight. So queen e7, this knight cannot develop because of the pawn. And the computer wants to slow play this with b3, bishop b2, because black cannot do anything. These pieces are stuck, completely stuck. I guess the only way out is g6, king g7 ideas, but I suppose b3 is intended to go bishop b2 to stop those plans. So knight g5, bishop g5 is forced. Queen g4 has to be played to get a piece back and threaten both of these things at the same time. The best move here for black is actually bishop takes h4, which I did mention in the game, but I thought after rook h4, de5, de5 if knight e5, queen f4, I think I did miss the move queen to f6, defending the knight and blocking the check. And the computer thinks I can just drop my queen back, and I'm good here. Rook e8, bishop e3 preparing long castle, if knight c4 attacking the bishop. Oh no, sorry, the knight can't go to c4, so we don't have those issues to be worried about. And then we castle queenside, and to be honest, although the computer says it's better for black, I think that white has a nice initiative here, and I think I'd probably go on to win this game. This also exists, so black has to deal with that first. Stop me from castling. Even then, rook f4 check, knight f6, knight e4. This is still very, very disturbing for black to try and maneuver? Like, coordinate his pieces. But my opponent goes bishop to e7, which is the far less complicated version. e6 check. As I mentioned, king e8 is actually worse, because we don't take the knight. If we take the knight, then queen d7, black's okay. But we actually play queen g7. We threaten mate, and we threaten the rook, and we threaten the knight. Knight h6 is the best move. Queen h8 check, knight f8, knight d5, and white is just completely winning here. Completely winning. So my opponent chooses correct with king to f8. We take on d7. Knight f6 is, of course, the best move. Attacking the queen, attacking the pawn, so we take on f4 with the queen. And here my opponent goes c6. And I'm like, what? c6? Just take the pawn. Take the pawn. And here white's only move to maintain the advantage is to castle. Because if queen g4, it can't be played because the knight's pinned. Because if I do anything else, if I go like bishop d2, like I had ideas of like queen g4 and queen to f2, although the computer thinks I can take, maybe castle with check, and it becomes really difficult for black to develop this rook, which makes a lot of sense. Makes a lot of sense. But c6, like, what? And actually, I would encourage you to try and find the best move for white here. It's g4, which I considered, but I rejected because of the move h6. Interestingly, however, rook f1 can be played. And I thought, well, okay, king g8, g5. Oh, okay, I see the problem. Black can't just do like takes and move the knight, because I will just mate black. This I didn't notice. I forgot about that the queen could come to f7. So that makes complete sense, which is why bishop to d2 is a blunder. Apart from the move g4, bishop d2 is okay. My opponent takes on d7. We castle queenside. King e8, I did not understand at all. And I did mention the move d5 was tempting, but I didn't see what we did after cd5. Now, if knight takes d5, knight takes d5, cd5, then okay, that makes sense, because I have moves like bishop to c3. I have moves like I don't know, rook e1, and black is kind of struggling here. But I thought that if he just takes immediately, what have I gained? Computer thinks that I'm better after queen d4, maybe preparing bishop g5, and going after the d5 pawn, and then I suppose d6 would be weak. But I go rook d to e1, which is still a good move. Still a good move. King d8, again, strange. I go knight e4, and that's a mistake. If knight e4, which I thought was the only move. After queen e4, you have to go d5. You have to do this. And then let's say queen e3 the computer wants. Bishop d6. I suppose, yeah, you are getting out a bit here. Queen g5. King c7. Even still, it looks decent for white. Even still, because you can't... Oh, king b6 is the only move to not lose instantly. I'm sorry, but even here, after rook to h3, you've got to find a6, giving the king an escape on a7, which of course makes sense, but this is very difficult to play. Very difficult to play. And you don't even have to give the check. You can do something like this, trying to get into e7. And then if you challenge rook e5, white still definitely has the initiative here. But that's a very long line, and my opponent doesn't find it. He goes rook to f8, and we find knight to g5. And here, black is lost. He's just completely lost because of knight to e6. King c8 is the only move that really stops knight to e6, but you can just play it anyway. You can play it anyway, and if the rook moves, d5 exists, rook h to f1 exists. You probably have to slow play this position a little bit with white and try and massage the advantage. Play on the fact that black can't really move very easily. Maybe try g4, g5. You have threats of queen c7, the knight is pinned to the rook, you have pressure on the bishop. Maybe this knight can move with some kind of discovery in the future. The knight can always come back to g5. This bishop is yet to get properly involved. You probably have to slow play it a bit, but it's definitely a lot better for white. The issue is that my opponent chooses knight to d5, and my initial thought was, okay, I just go queen g3, and we have so much pressure in this position that I'm probably winning. Bishop g5, I thought, okay, we probably just go bishop g5, and the king moves, and we're better, and we slow play the position. c4 is a threat, kind of, because if the knight moves, then there's rook to e7, but the knight can go to f6 to block the bishop's connection. However, you're supposed to take with the h-pawn to open up the rook, keep the knight dominated, and again, you probably have to slow play the position a bit. h7's kind of impossible to defend, though, because if rook to h8, c4, the knight is running out of squares very quickly, and g6... g6 you can't take because of take, and if you take with a knight, you take here, take, check, here, here, and it's two rooks and a bishop versus a queen, which, I mean, is obviously better for the two rooks and a bishop, but here I think particularly so, because white doesn't have major weaknesses, and the black king is very weak. However, the winning move is knight e6 check. We don't have to bother with queen g3, we can go straight for the kill. My opponent chooses to take, which is the best idea, and what I was saying was, the king, if the king moves, it can't go to c7 by the way, then we take on f8 with a knight, and if you take on f4, then I take on d7, and if you take on d7, then I take on f4, and we're up a rook. Fortunately, after knight takes f8, the queen is under attack, otherwise it wouldn't really work. So, my opponent takes, and you have to take on f8 first, because if you take the queen, then your opponent takes on f4, and he's up a piece. He's just up a piece. So you have to take on f8 first, bishop takes, rook takes queen, and now we're up the exchange. But of course we still have to convert this position. My opponent goes king d7, best move. I go rook h2 e1, apparently retreating the rook was the best, which I suppose makes sense, because after a move like bishop to e7, we can, let's just say for the sake of argument, g3, rook f8, rook h to f1, and we control the two open files and try and facilitate a rook trade, because a rook trade makes it easier for us to win this game. But I went rook h to e1, my opponent goes bishop to e7, I go c4. And the problem is that it's basically impossible for black to do anything else. Although bishop to e7 allows c4, which forces black into a piece down endgame, black has nothing better. Because the second best move here is knight to f6. And after bishop g5, what do? You can't move this bishop still. The best move is knight g8. Just begging to try and hold on to the e7 square. And I mean, this is obviously completely lost, because the rook can't go to e8 or f8, the bishop can't move, the knight can't move, and the computer says, oh, just move your pawns. That's all black can do. I mean, white could be particularly cruel here with a move like c3 maybe, to stop the bishop even going to b4, although I suppose it has the d6 square. Still though, black has nothing better than what he did with bishop e7, which allows c4. Bishop h4 only move, because if you move the knight anywhere, then we just take the bishop, and it's so over. So c4, bishop h4, cd5, bishop e1, and rook takes e1 is the best move, slightly, cd5, and here we go bishop g5. Now rook e3 is apparently the best, which I don't understand. Rook f8, rook g3, g6, rook h3, rook f7. I suppose, but I like what we did with bishop g5 because we get the rook into e7 kind of by force. Because black has to, after giving a check, has to go rook e8 to stop us. He has no other option other than h6. But black can't afford to trade rooks, so he has to try this. Rook e7, and the only reason this works is because, one, the king can't go to d6. If the king could go to d6, then the rook would be under attack and the bishop would be under attack, and after bishop to h4, g5 would cut the bishop off and attack the bishop, and we would have to give back the bishop and probably be losing. The reason this works is because the only move black has to keep connection with the rook is king to d8, which loses because of rook g7 discovered check, pawn takes bishop, and rook g8 winning the rook. That's the only reason it works. So that's why I went for it. Which means the king has to step away. We drop the bishop back. Rook f8, we take on g7, h5. And here I thought that rook h7 was actually a bad move. Because I've realized, wait. I mean, firstly, black can just go rook f5 to try and hang on to it. But rook g8, I can't defend the pawn. So after takes, I'm still completely winning because I am up a bishop. But the task becomes a little bit more difficult here because all the pawns on the king's side disappear. What my opponent did though with a5 made no sense, because after rook h5, he just started throwing the pawns forward, which I suppose I understand, but it means that my g-pawn just marches up the board. We defend it, b3, takes, g7. I liked the move king b5 from my opponent, that's a very smart move. And we should have gone king d2 here. I mean, rook c8, I didn't want to allow anything. I know I can queen, and this is fine. We're just going to mate black anyway. So maybe I shouldn't have been so concerned about that. But we go king d1, the king comes to c4. I don't want to allow king to d3, so I go king to d2. And the only way for black to really continue this position is king b4, because if king b5, I realized I could just take on d5. And after king c4, just bring the rook straight back. So king b4 would mean that this doesn't come with check, and this would be a silly move for white to play. And I mean, obviously the game is over. Like, the game is completely over. Something like king d3, bishop f4, bishop d6, bishop to f8 maybe, trapping the rook in jail, just for example. Like, not like that. Like this maybe. That would be kind of hilarious, to trap the rook. And then it's just a king and a rook versus a king, which is obviously completely winning. But my opponent resigns, which I don't blame him for. whatsoever. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I've been really enjoying making this series, and if you haven't liked and subscribed yet, please do. I know I said it earlier in the video, but it really, really motivates me. And check out this video that's appearing somewhere on the screen if you want to see another awesome game in the Vienna.